we'll go back to the beginning, but I'm kind of curious about how did you end up getting interested in this area of studying amputees? Like, what was appealing to you about that, or what was the problem set that you were interested in exploring?
Yeah, so I was working at the time at Dartmouth College up in New Hampshire, kind of your neck of the woods, I guess, huh? To some degree. And I was looking at how the brain, what was the potential of the brain to repair itself or reconfigure functions when someone had a stroke. That was a big interest of mine. And one of the challenges of doing that work, I was using these new techniques for imaging the brain, functional MRI. People may be familiar with seeing these wonderful colored pictures of brain activity and so forth. And that's usually created with that kind of technology that was just coming onto the scene in the 90s when I was doing this work. We're imaging the brains of all these stroke patients and trying to figure out how could we coax the brain to start to reorganize functions that would have been accomplished by an area of the brain that had been damaged due to the stroke, and move those functions into other healthy areas of the brain. And is that even possible? And I started getting really interested in basic questions about how the brain changes in response to changes in experience. And that's what really led me to look at the amputees. With an amputation of a hand, for example, which has been kind of the focus of that work, you've got all these areas of the brain that are involved in controlling the movements of our hands, that are involved in controlling all of the sensory processing that our hands do. Think about your hands. They sense pressure, they sense pain, they sense temperature changes. They're loaded with all these receptors that are specialized for those different dimensions of perception. All of that information gets sent to the brain, and there are vast areas of the brain that are concerned with deciphering those incoming signals. Well, what happens to them when you lose a hand? Do they just sit around and do nothing, right? Are they repurposed for other things? And that led to my moving into this really exciting area of looking at how injuries to the body impact brain organization. And that's what you read about.
So what drew you to stroke? So it sounds like you ended up in this domain of, I don't know what the term would be. What I'm hearing is it's something like compensatory adaptation, maybe. Like that's how I would characterize what you're describing. I'm sure there's a more technical term for it.
No, I think that's great. I think you've got it. We're really, we have a difficult challenge when it comes to brain injury, because there isn't a lot of evidence that we can regenerate damaged parts of our brain. So what is the other alternative that we could start to think about for getting recovery of functions when someone has a stroke, a traumatic brain injury, or some kind of degenerative disease like my mother had? And the place where a lot of effort has been invested is trying to study this thing called plasticity or neuroplasticity. The idea, if something is plastic, it can be changed and modeled by experience, right? Clay is plastic. We can shape it with our hands and change its form. To what extent are functions in our brain plastic? To what extent can different areas of the brain pick up functions that might have been lost to neural damage? If we can't regrow parts of the brain, then maybe we can exploit healthy areas of the brain to take on some of the functions that have been lost. And it was really that basic question. And my desire to involve myself in research questions that had real world implication potential. And the real world implication potential of those set of questions concern rehabilitation. And that's really where my passion has been for the last 25 years of my career.
I know this isn't the area where your research is focused specifically, as far as I know, but does compensatory adaptation take place in quote unquote healthy individuals? If someone, for example, has difficult with, I don't know, conceptualizing mathematics, for example, does anything potentially happen in their brain if so that they can then excel in that area? If someone is not innately or they struggle with the topic, does something happen with neuroplasticity whereby they can actually gain proficiency in an area or in a new or different way of thinking that might not be innate or natural for them? Or am I mistaken in thinking that people might have innate or natural cognitive abilities?
Well, those are very big questions. So I'm going to take the first one, and I'm going to step it back a little bit, Andrew. um, you know, I think something that even as someone who's been working in neuroscience for decades now, that I have to stop and remind myself all the time is that all of the things that I'm experiencing, my consciousness, my perceptions, my ability to learn, the control of movements of my body and so forth, are all originating in this 2 to 3 pound organ between our ears. So any behavior is going to have roots in neurophysiology, right? Within the brain. So if someone does find a method of training people to overcome something, some difficulty like stuttering or difficulty with mathematics, or in the case of people who aren't having difficulties but are acquiring a new skill like learning to play the guitar, all of that is remodeling the brain, right? There have to be changes taking place in the brain continuously throughout the day. We're having a conversation right now. We'll probably leave this conversation and think back about it, right? And our ability to do that is because we have formed memories, and those memories are literally reorganizational changes in the brain that have taken place to store that information.
And Scott, there are some really interesting aspects to your origin story. I originally heard you on the Fast Talk Labs podcast. As people will know from listening to the introduction of this episode, you also are and have been an endurance athlete adjacent to, what you do as a neuroscientist and researcher. And I'm curious about the role of exercise in neuroplasticity. I've read a lot about this, and something that I wonder, for people who are persistently physically active, does their neuroplasticity continue to increase if they're doing the same types of activities with maybe the same intensity, the same training load, or do they actually have to do something stochastic and create either spikes in volume intensity or vary the type of exercise that they're doing in order to foster and enable greater neuroplasticity?
So that's a great question. And I think these are really early days for understanding the brain mechanisms behind the kind of adaptations you're talking about. But if we think about training, right? We all know that the way we respond as organisms is through adaptation. So you impart some kind of training load on an organism. There are adaptations that take place in the cardiovascular system and the neuromuscular system, and certainly in the central nervous system, in the brain and spinal cord as well. And we know that in these other systems, cardiovascular, neuromuscular, once those adaptations take place, something has to be changed. You have to have a new stimulus or a different stimulus to get further adaptations, right? You either have to increase your workload by upping the resistance or upping the duration or playing with those different dimensions that we have to manipulate in a training. And I would fully expect the same thing to happen in the central nervous system. I think we just don't have the degree of insight into how the brain adapts in response to training in a way that would allow me to say, yes, and you should go read this study. I think we'll get there, but we're not there yet. But I would fully expect that to be similar to other systems.
Yeah, I know I'm kind of all over the place here, but I just have so many questions for you. And one of the questions that I have, and I kind of wanted to put this on the front end of this podcast, because something that I've observed and that I've also experienced myself, I listen to podcasts all the time. I consume a pretty high volume of content. I was actually re-listening to that Fast Talk Labs podcast with you yesterday and today. The first time I listened to it, I was out mowing my lawn. I always carry a small notebook with me everywhere. And if an idea pops into my brain and I want to research it further, I always stop and write down whatever that idea is. And during that podcast, I jotted down a number of ideas. And it seems that often when we're consuming a lot of information, we might have this idea that we're ingesting the information. We know we're doing that. I think we have this sense that we're learning or we're acquiring knowledge, but I've also experienced and observed that you might listen to a 1 to 3 hour podcast, think you learned a lot, and then you kind of forget everything. So is there anything in research that speaks to this phenomenon of conflating hearing something or seeing something with actually learning or acquiring knowledge, or is this just a wacky idea that I have?
Well, I don't really know what you're talking about. You mean you don't always remember everything that you listen to and read? Yeah, this is a dilemma that we all have, right? And there's a vast literature that spans the world of experimental psychology, where I came from, as well as neuroscience, about the factors that contribute to being able to encode and retain information. And I think we think about the retention part a lot because we have these sort of vague recollections. Like, I remember I read that book, or I saw that movie, or I had that conversation, but I just can't get the details, right? But you know, where was I going with this? Right. As a living example, I lost my train of thought of what I was about to say to you. Yeah, we don't often focus on the other part, which is really important, which is the encoding part. So if you're going to commit something to memory, if you're going to form those changes at the level of the synapses in the neurons that encode something into long-term memory, there are a number of things that are really important for that. And one of them is how you encode that information. How do you weave it in with all the other information that is occurring all the time in our lives, right? So I'm picturing you out there with your headphones on, and you've got your, safety glasses on, and you're listening to the podcast. You got your notebook in your pocket, and you're pushing the lawnmower around or driving the lawnmower around. There's a lot going on. There's a lot of stuff competing for your attention, right? I would be willing to bet that if you sat in a quiet room and really focused, right, and got rid of all that immense amount of information that's competing for a very limited bandwidth channel, right? We have attentional resources. They're limited. The gateway into your consciousness, right, is through attention. And unfortunately, the bandwidth of attention is pretty limited. I mean, I say unfortunately, but that's really adaptive, right? It keeps us from having to try and sort out all that massive information. If we were to encode everything, then we'd have the opposite problem of deciding what to keep and what to get rid of. Attention works on the front end to kind of filter a lot of that stuff out in the first place, right? So we can focus our attention. And probably as you're mowing the lawn, there are things that were more important than what you were hearing me talk about in the podcast, right? There were, making sure you don't run over the blueberry bush or whatever is going on. And so memory and learning have really the two sides. There's the encoding part that involves attention, and then there's the retrieval part. And that's, and memories can be difficult to form due to on either end. They can either have encoding problems or retrieval problems.
And Scott, when I was doing research for this episode, I was reading a feature that was written about you, and it talked a bit about your childhood and your path into the sciences, and it was a bit unconventional. Can you talk about what was going on in your childhood, and then what was your path? How did you get to this spot where you are now?
Yeah, what a great question. I use this as an example to my kids who are both in college now and trying to figure out what their future is going to look like. And I try to impress upon them that it's often very hard to predict what that's going to be. You need to have some kind of a plan, but you need to be flexible. And my life, I guess, is in some ways an illustration of this. So I was raised by a single mom, and my mom was a registered nurse, but then had to stop her career, her profession, because of multiple sclerosis, which is a degenerative neurological disease that affects the central nervous system, the brain and the spinal cord. And it affected my mom's ability to work. It affected her ability to walk. It affected her ability to use her hands. And eventually started to affect cognitive things as well. And my mom was an incredibly positive human. and she was able to raise me on Social Security disability benefits that had accrued by paying into the Social Security system while she was working, on very, very little money. And we grew up in a very modest trailer in a trailer park in upstate New York. My mom was the only person on either side of my family that had ever gone to college. Everyone else went to work immediately, and most didn't finish high school. In fact, I'm pressed to think of anybody in aunts, uncles, grandparents that father that finished high school. Everyone went to work out of necessity. And once I reached the age of 14 and 15, I was already working nearly full time after school at night in an Italian restaurant in our town. And by the time I was 15 or so, I was not showing up for school very often, as one might imagine. You know, working the kind of hours that I was working illegally under the table is not that conducive with being a student. And as soon as I turned 16, I left school, and I was following in the tradition of the family, in a sense, going to work, right? And that, interestingly enough, was not the end of my educational career. I had always loved books. I had always loved learning. I grew up in a house full of reading, full of books. My mom was very a very thoughtful person and a very well-read person, as was my grandfather, my mom's dad. And there was a real emphasis on the importance of continually learning new things. And that wasn't lost on me. And so the first thing I did when I left high school was go sign up for a course at the community college at night, English 101. And I worked during the day as a landscaper, and went to college at night, taking English 101. And then once that was completed, I took the high school equivalency exam, got my GED, and then I was able to get financial aid and start going to community college full-time and switch back to working in restaurants at night. So that was the beginning, the genesis of things.
Scott, I have to ask, how did you feel at that moment in time when you made that decision out of necessity to drop out of high school? And what did you think was possible for you in life?
Well, it's notable that at 16 years old, I developed an ulcer. So it was an enormously stressful time. And I think I had this feeling that this was what needed to happen for economic reasons. Financially, things were tough. And it also felt very much like my life was headed in a particular track, which was going to be manual labor from here on out. And that was scary. It was hard to think about. As a young person, we have dreams and aspirations and so forth. And it really seemed like those were foreclosing very rapidly. And I was under a lot of stress at that time. I remember that clearly. And it took a physical toll on me. You know, I had to be treated for this stress-related ulcer at a really young age. What was really wonderful, though, is that the experience I had at that community college, it was life-altering. And we can talk about that if you'd like, but it really was what set me on the path that I'm still on. Yeah,
what happened? I'd love to hear about it.
I met my mentor. I met my life mentor, who was a professor, a young professor at that community college. In fact, he had finished his master's degree and was still working part-time on his PhD at a nearby university, at Syracuse University. I grew up in upstate New York. And this person and I clicked, and how we connected was through running. I had started running, and running was really something I latched onto as a kind of stable force in my life. It was a routine. It took discipline, and it really served to kind of orient my life in a daily kind of ritual sort of way. And I think as an athlete yourself, you'll understand how this kind of athletic endeavor can become a practice, right? And it was a love that this young college professor also shared, who was about 10 years older than me, maybe 15. And I saw him in the locker room one day at the community college, and he invited me to go out for a run. At the time, I was taking his introduction to psychology class. And throughout that run, John was his name, John Rybash, we bonded, and then we met for another run, and then another run. And through that relationship in the classroom and the friendship that developed through this shared passion for running, he really became a life mentor for me. And from that local community college, I went on to the local four-year college. And John was a big force in that decision. And I continued to study psychology, and he got interested in neuroscience, and he got me interested in neuroscience. And I excelled at that local college, and was encouraged by John to apply to Harvard Graduate School of Education to get a master's degree. And I thought, this is really crazy stuff, right? What chance would I have? I'm coming from this little college in upstate New York. But lo and behold, I got in. And, I never would have tried had I not had his encouragement. And that was the beginning. From there, I ended up going to Cornell University and getting my PhD. I was just talking to my daughter the other day, and I said, how long do you think it was between when I quit high school and when I completed the PhD at Cornell? Because I realized this myself the other day, and it really shocked me. And she said, oh, I don't know, Dad, 30 years? It was 10 years. And I said, a lot can happen in 10 years, right? Between the ages of 16 and 26, I went from being this high school dropout at the working end of a shovel, to having a master's degree from Harvard, and then the PhD in experimental psychology from Cornell, and starting my first job as a professor.
How did your sense of what was possible expand over time? Or did you always have a level of self-belief that you could go on and do whatever you wanted?
I never had a level of self-belief that I could go on and do what I wanted. I had a sense of appreciation for the things I had and gratitude for what I had, but I didn't ever see opportunities like those that my life is actually presented, right? Never imagined I'd be sitting here doing a podcast, for example, or any of the things we've been talking about. But gradually, as things unfolded, I started to realize that this wasn't all just happening by accident, that I must be making some right moves. And the more success that I had academically, the more motivated and excited I became. And I want to stress that in parallel with that, my passion for running was continuing to grow. And that the two of those things were really highly intertwined, because what I learned from running was that there was a payoff for work, right? That if you put your shoes on and you went out there every day, even when you were tired and didn't feel like it, and you did the thing, that at the end of the month, you'd be fitter than you were at the beginning of the month. And I treated my academic life exactly the same way. I was never the person who let things go until the last minute. I treated it like running, right? You wouldn't decide you were going to run a marathon next October and wait until August to start your training. You would start picking away at it, laying a base. And that's exactly the method that I took to my academics. I would work steadily, right? I wasn't the champion of staying up late into the night and all those things, but I got up early every morning and I did the thing. I did the work and then trained.
One of the things that you discussed on that Fast Talk podcast was this concept that our anticipation of the effort that we're about to put out in endurance sports, like in the context of you're going to run a 5K, a 10K, a half marathon, a marathon, or in my case, I'm going to do a bike race potentially. But your brain is predicting or modeling what that effort is going to feel like. And then that informs subconsciously the pace that you might assume as you head off of the line, if I'm mirroring back what I heard correctly. And as I'm hearing you tell your story, I'm wondering if it might be possible to transpose that research into the domain of how people generally perceive their limits or what is possible for them. Or maybe I'm taking too big of a leap here, but as I'm hearing you tell your story, it sounds to me like at the point at which you dropped out, you had this subconscious or conscious map of what might be possible for you in life. And over time, that shifted through the influence of mentors, through your involvement in endurance sports. But is there any kind of relationship there between studies of physiologically how people anticipate effort and maybe how that applies to other areas where we apply effort in our lives? Or am I reaching?
No, I think it's great. This is a great thing to think about. And my answer is that we have one brain. We don't have a brain for doing athletics and a brain for doing academics and a brain for doing business and a brain for doing music. We have one brain, and it has a bunch of functions that have evolved to keep us alive, right? And if you were to ask me what is the overarching purpose of this big brain that we have as humans, I would say it is to control behaviors that are adaptive, right? Just a very basic answer. That's what it's evolved to do. And how does it do that? Well, our brains do that in ways that you're touching on here, right? We take in information through our perceptual systems, right? We can see, we can hear, smell, taste, we can sense pain. That information is integrated with our past experiences. We have associations with the patterns that we're experiencing through our senses, right? Some of them we've experienced before. We can then use that information to start to make predictions about what's likely to happen next, right? A lot of what the brain is doing, this big human brain we have, is integrating sensory information, and that's coming from inside of us. It has to do with our perceptions of, our state of arousal, as well as all of the information we're getting from the outside world. It's integrating that with our past experiences and trying to make accurate predictions about the future so that we can anticipate what's going to happen next. And it's through anticipation that we're able to be prepared. We're able to respond, and not just in a reactive way. We're able to be prepared and respond in a much more adaptive way. And that's really, I think, why we have these giant human brains that we carry around with us. And that serves all of the sorts of behaviors that we're engaged in, right? We're doing that when we're having this conversation with one another, right? I'm anticipating where you're going with this. You're anticipating where I'm going with this. That's based on your perceptions of the things I'm saying, and your past experience, because now you know a little bit about me. You've read some things, you've listened to some things. I've done the same. I've listened to your podcast. I've got a sense of how you conduct interviews. Those predictions are never going to be 100% right. They're probabilistic, right? But we're constantly doing that. And we're doing it over really small increments of time, like the kind of predictions that are taking place within this motor system we have that controls our movements, happening at a very subconscious level. We're not able to think about that in a conscious way. But we're also doing it over larger increments of time, too, in terms of thinking about our future and goals and how we're going to move toward those. And that involves often a more conscious aspect also.
And Scott, one of the things that seems to happen when we're doing something for the first time, whether it's we're physically navigating new territory, you know what? Actually, I don't know if people have this experience so much anymore because they're so reliant upon their phones and GPS. But it used to be the case that if you were in a new neighborhood or something and you're wandering around, you don't know the area, or you're going out on a long run, a long ride, a hike, whatever, you might have to physically read a map. But when you're passing through new territory physically or intellectually, if you're entering into a new domain, a new space, you're taking on new subject matter, or you're going deeper into a subject, time tends to dilate. It tends to slow down when things are hard, and that can actually amplify our sense of the difficulty of what we're experiencing. What does research say about what's happening when we experience that time dilation? Like, what's going on? Why does it feel like that?
Well, I will start by saying that your intuition is a good one, right? You can look to some of the studies that have been done at the sort of fledgling crossover world between brain science and exercise science, where people have done some really beautiful studies looking at how people perceive time. A lot of these things have been done in the case that I'm thinking of on a stationary cycling ergometer, right, where you can really control the load that someone's putting out. You can control the work, and you can control the effort that people are. You can have them work at a certain percentage of their VO2 max or something, right? And people perceive time very differently when they're working really hard. Right? If you do a set of intervals, you go out on your bike and you're going to do a set of, 5 by 5 minute intervals, very common sort of interval structure in cycling. Your perception of time changes over the course of that set of intervals, right? And it's a very different flavor during that first interval when you're fresh than that fifth interval when you're pretty depleted, right? That can seem a lot longer than the first interval did. Or if you go out for just a steady ride for an hour with your buddies, time can really fly by. Albert Einstein has this wonderful quote, and I'm going to butcher it, but it really gets at the essence of this thing, right? And the point he's making here is that time is a construction of the mind, right? It's an illusion in a sense. He said, a minute spent with a beautiful woman is so fleeting compared to, a minute when you're experiencing something uncomfortable. It was much more elegant than that. I butchered it, but the point is there. Time is a construction of your brain, right? It's like all perceptions, right? There's information that you're monitoring and picking up, but the conscious experience you have of time is very plastic, is very flexible.
How can we leverage that to our advantage?
Yeah, so how can we make the fifth interval on that set feel just as great as the first one did, right?
Or maybe you're taking on some new task at work. You've been asked to step up into a new responsibility. Something challenging happens in your family, like whatever the case may be.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was having a conversation with a group of life coaches the other evening, and we were talking a little bit about something that relates to this, and that is that if you've got a goal that you want to accomplish, right, and whether it's an athletic goal, a work goal, any kind of goal, it's not just enough to have the goal, right? You've got to come up with some method for implementing it. And one of the things that psychological research supports is the idea of something called implementation intentions. And these are just simple if-then statements. And they can, the point of having these simple if-then statements is to kind of try to take the thinking out of it, right? So where I'm going with this is that we know that when we're pursuing a particular goal, there are certain kind of predictable obstacles that we're going to experience. And to the extent that we can automate how we're going to respond when those obstacles come up and take the thinking and decision-making out of that process, the greater our chances of not being detoured by those obstacles, the more resilient we're going to be when we get to them. So I think a mistake a lot of us make, myself included, is that when we have a goal, we spend a lot of time focusing on the positives and how great it's going to be when we get to the goal. I just signed up to ski the Birkebeiner. It's this 50K cross-country ski race up in Wisconsin because I need a goal right now. And, it's very easy for me to sit here and think about, wow, that's great. I can tell Andrew I did this, and I'm gonna go off and do this race. It's gonna feel so good when I'm done. It's gonna feel great because I love to ski, but there will be hard times. But unless I really think seriously about how I'm going to get through those hard times and have a plan, those if-then statements can provide that kind of structure. If, right, I start to experience whatever. If I get really cold in the first 5 kilometers, then, right, what am I going to do? I'm going to stop and I'm going to take a feed or whatever kind of thing it is. But the point is, I'm not going to have to think about it. I'm going to have that if-then statement rehearsed and ready to go. I'm just going to pull it out and do the thing. I'm not going to debate. I'm not going to think about, maybe I should push through here and ignore this. This is the plan, right? And the plan includes these if-then statements, these implementation intentions to overcome the obstacles. And again, it's somewhat about prediction, right? We can predict a lot of the things that are going to get in the way. And of course, there are things we can't predict. Our predictions will never be perfect, right? I might break a pole. Well, in cross-country ski racing, that's not uncommon. So I'll have a plan for that. I'll know how I'm going to get another pole if and when I break a pole. I'm not going to have to think about it then. Is that helpful?
Yeah, definitely. And Scott, I know that you've done a lot of work outside of the academic domain in your consulting practice, working with high performers in different disciplines, athletes. And did you happen to read Jonathan Vaughter's autobiography by chance?
I know who Jonathan Vaughter is, but I've not read his biography.
Okay. Well, I did read it. I'm hoping to have Jonathan on here sometime soon. And it's one of the things I'd like to talk to him about is his autobiography that came out, I think, about 2 years ago. But one of the things that really struck me, if you're not familiar with Jonathan, world-class cyclist, had record times on some of the hardest climbs in the Tour de France for a while and had a pretty spectacular career. Now has EF, Education First, Easy Post, is the world tour team that he owns and manages. And one of the things that really struck me about his autobiography is that when he was a young man, when he started out, he had the experience that everybody has when they go to do their first bike race, and it didn't go quite the way he wanted it to. And then he put in this massive amount of training, pushed through all the difficulty. He also did have some pretty exceptional genetic gifts, a naturally very high hematocrit, and some other things that benefited him. But he experienced all of the typical difficulties anyone would have at any ability level. And that really jumped out at me because I remembered when I was a young person going out trying to do bike races, granted at a much lower level. I was like, oh, this guy who's became a world-class athlete actually experienced all of the very same things. And one of the strategies that I developed later in my competitive cycling career, which was relatively unspectacular, but it's been going on for several decades now. But over time, a method I developed is kind of a catch-all. And I think part of what you're highlighting here is you need to anticipate that difficult things are going to happen, whether it's in sport or in life. And then if you can have some kind of strategy to reduce the cognitive load, whatever pops up, that's going to help you move past it because it's not a new or surprising thing. Because the expectation is just difficult things are going to pop up. They're not going to be that pleasant to experience very often. And if you can have a strategy baked in ahead of time, then it's going to enable you to not have to think about it very much and move past it. And the one that I developed for bike racing was however my body felt or whatever was going on in a race, when it was something that I didn't like, I just told myself, because the question would always come up, why am I doing this? Why did I pay money? Why did I spend hundreds and hundreds of hours and probably tens of thousands of dollars over the course of decades to go out and do this to myself when other people are, doing whatever it is that they enjoy? Maybe they're out golfing or drinking a beer and watching a football game. But the mantra I had for myself that I still use is when the question of why am I doing this comes up, the answer is because this is what I'm doing right now. And I just baked that in because it's like I already made the decision I was going to do this thing. I know that something's going to pop up, and it's just a reminder. It's like, hey, man, this is what you're doing right now. Be present to what's happening and just push forward.
Yeah.
So
I love it. So this brings up something really important that I think is worth mentioning, right? There's the conscious experience that we have of the stuff that's going on. That stuff includes that little inner voice inside our head that can be really a great companion sometimes, but can really be a difficult voice at times too, and particularly difficult when the going gets tough, right? And it starts saying things like, yeah, maybe you should just pull over, because in the middle of one of these races, whether it's running, skiing, biking, whatever, the pain stops when you stop, right? You have complete control over that discomfort that you're experiencing. All you need to do is just roll to the side of the road, let go of the rubber band that's holding you to that group, and let them go up the road, and you'll be fine, right? And the temptation is enormous. And that's the conscious part, right? That and the perceptions you're having about how bad you feel, right? How much your quads are burning, and that you can't possibly hold on for another 5 seconds. And the game in bike racing is you don't know when they're going to ease up, right? And it could be in literally 5 seconds that they're going to sit up a little bit and recover. But if you let go, there's no hope, because 5 seconds with them up the road, you're done. What you're not aware of is like the 80+% of stuff that's running in the background that's controlling your actions and your behavior. It's the subconscious, right? Most of the functions that I study in my lab and that most neuroscientists study are things we're not aware of. They're happening in the background, right? If you think of an iceberg, the little bit of the iceberg that's above the waterline is the conscious stuff that's going on. What's below the waterline is the bulk of the iceberg. And it's the same thing with the human mind, right? The mind is what the brain does. And most of that happens outside of our awareness. We have that limited bandwidth of cognitive reserve. And that bandwidth gets really narrow when we're under pain, when we're in the heat of competition. And so the more that you can do to have a mantra like you have, or to have those implementation intentions, what you're doing is really automating things. That's like shifting it off into the non-conscious aspects, right? Getting it out of the decision. The decision, as you pointed out, it's already made. You're there, right? You're in, man. This is not the time. I remember I raced a pretty seriously triathlons in the 1990s. And I remember sometimes when it wasn't going well, just thinking, or in training even, the going to my lab sounded so great, right? Like, oh, I just would love to be in my lab right now. That would be really great, as opposed to out here riding for 4 hours in the cold rain in upstate New York or whatever. But I'd already made the decision, right? Here I am, and I think that's exactly you've gotten onto something really powerful, which is we need to take the conscious decision making out of a lot of this stuff. Have the plan, have the mantra or the implementation intention. And there's research to back that is very effective, right? I had a friend who nearly missed making the Olympic swim team in the US, which is, the Olympic trials in the US are often faster than the Olympic finals. This guy's a beast. And he was my training partner in triathlon, and he helped my swimming immensely. And I used to ask him, I'd say, hey, Peter, when you get better and stronger, does it get easier? And he said, no, it's just as hard, but you go faster, right? And I think that's important to think about. Somebody like Jonathan Vaughters, amazing cyclist, worked incredibly hard to get where he is, maybe has some ability, talent, and so forth, as you mentioned. But he's not suffering less than you're suffering when you're struggling to hang on to the back of the pack in a Cat 3 criterion.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you noted, practicing those techniques to eventually achieve automaticity, so you're at that level of frictionless non-thinking when things pop up, seems like it's highly beneficial. And as you think about endurance sports generally, which is something you and I have in common, we both enjoy doing it. We both have competed at various levels. What is it that draws humans to electively spend their time and money to go do something that, if we're honest with ourselves, beyond a very low threshold, I truly don't believe that you're doing anything to add to your health beyond probably like a fairly minimal amount of walking and strength training. And, we could probably have a debate about that, but you don't need to go out and do an Ironman to be a healthy person. And in fact, there are probably a lot of unhealthy aspects about it. Same thing with bike racing, yet people are drawn to do it. What is it that draws people to undertake these sports or to compete in these races? Like, why?
Yeah. No, what a great question. I'm going to give you a very non-scientific answer. I'm going to just give you my own take on this, if that's all right, because I don't think I can say, well, of course the literature says this, right? I don't think we know, right? Um, Here's what I think. I think modern life is really safe for many of us, and it's really boring, and there isn't a lot of adventure, right? And I think by going out and putting ourselves in these difficult situations, we get a little taste of that sense of living on the edge, that sense of excitement that comes when you're out of your comfort zone. I could spend my in 24/7, right? I could just more or less be in my comfort zone. When it's cold, I'm very fortunate in this way, right? And in fact, as a kid, there were times when I wasn't in my comfort zone, not by choice, right? Um, but now it's great, go turn up the thermostat when it's cold. Oh, it gets really hot sometimes. I'll have the air conditioner on. What would I like to eat for breakfast? We're going to finish this interview. I'm going to go over to my favorite coffee shop and get the special coffee that I enjoy, right? Life is pretty comfortable for some of us, right? And I think that some of us are drawn to putting ourselves in situations that aren't so comfortable. We still have control over them, right? So we're not really, for most of us, I guess you could think about people doing like high risk mountaineering and extreme skiing and things as kind of being at a further end of the continuum. But folks like us, I'm going to go out on a training ride later today, pretty sure I'm going to be home in time for dinner and everything's going to be cool. I'm going to get a little uncomfortable and I'm going to gain some kind of sense of resilience and strength from having gone through that I wouldn't have if I stayed in and spent my day on the computer or playing my guitar or whatever. That's what I think. I think some people crave a sense of accomplishment that comes with doing this. I crave the structure of having an athletic life. It's been something that I started at age 17. I'm 57. And I've been pretty consistent all that time. I've been very fortunate not to have huge injuries, although I have a knee that is now not happy to run. So I bike race and I ski race and I swim. But I think that's it. I think it's about having that sense of getting out and doing something hard.
And Scott, before we started recording today, you shared with me that you're in a bit of a transition yourself right now. You're making some shifts, you're making some moves. Can you talk a bit about what's happening and where you're headed?
Yeah, so in 2023, it'll be 30 years since I finished my PhD and started my first job as a professor. And during that time, I've had a great run. We've done a lot of research that I'm very proud of. I've trained a bunch of scientists who've gone off around the world to do their thing. I've run a couple of brain imaging research centers and been a professor at a couple of great institutions with terrific colleagues. But I'm deciding to step out after 30 years and reinvent myself. And there are a lot of factors that are playing into that. But a big part of that is what we were just talking about. I'm ready for a new adventure. I'm ready to get out of my comfort zone and try some new things. At 57, I'm fortunate. I have great health. I have a wonderful, supportive wife, great kids, great stepkids, and I'm ready to, with their help and support, I'm a fortunate enough person that I'm able to be to take some risks and try some new things. I'm craving new sources of stimulation.
Can you share a bit about what those new sources of stimulation might be?
Yeah, so writing has always been a big passion of mine. It's been the part of the science career that I actually loved best, which makes me a bit of an unusual beast in the world of science. And so I used to write for Inside Triathlon magazine. My name was Scott Johnson at the time. I took my mom's maiden name later in life after my kids were born, Frey. I'm going to continue to do writing. I've got a book project I'm really excited about. I'm doing some adult education projects that are related to the kinds of things we're talking about. And I also started Neurocognitive Consultants, and you had alluded to that earlier. And the goal of that is really to work with a small number of people as well as companies that are interested in harnessing some of the power of neuroscience and experimental psychology to benefit human growth, whether it's in the athletic realm or in the career realm.
What does that look like in practice? So what is the application, and how do you map what you've learned as a neuroscientist or in behavioral or experimental psychology into working with athletes or working with people on the corporate side?
Yeah, so I'm just getting started with this, but it really involves some of the things we touched on today, right? We know from a large volume of psychological research that there are ways that people can approach structuring their lives that are going to be more likely, much more likely to lead them to success in realizing a goal, and that there are other approaches that we might be drawn to intuitively that aren't that effective. Those kinds of tools have very practical implications that we can implement. And of course, my approach is to step back and look at things from a biological perspective as a neuroscientist as well. And so we were talking a little bit earlier about the brain being a prediction machine, and that the sorts of information it's using to make these predictions. Well, there are ways that we can start to play with that a little bit, right? There are ways that we can start to seek enhancements in performance by paying more attention to the kind of feedback that people are getting, and working with that feedback. In some cases, removing certain sorts of feedback that are holding people back, and augmenting other sorts of feedback that may help them to move to a new level in performance. Thinking of cycling a lot, I'm pretty focused on that as my main activity these days. And in the time that I was away from bike racing, there's been just such an explosion of technology. I took a break from bike racing, was just focused on running and career for a good time and a good bit of time. And when I came back into it, it's like power meters are suddenly just like every half of the recreational riders around here have really great power meters because the price point has come down. They're accessible, the software to use them. It's not like it was when I left, where they were really rare, super expensive, and you kind of had to know a lot to be able to make sense of the data, right? You can just get that off your head unit now like nothing. There are ways to think about the integration of that kind of technology that gives us physiological access to physiological variables like heart rate and so forth that we can't access just with the sensors that exist within our bodies biologically. And so I'm interested in thinking about ways we can start to manipulate that feedback to get people to new levels.
So taking a look at holistically a person is a biological system, like looking at that data and then applying strategies that are research-based, evidence-backed, it sounds like.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think the evidence-based part is really important, right? I have a lot of experience in my life, as we all do. Mine happens to be of a certain flavor, right? I've been a scientist for a lot of years, and I've been an athlete for a lot of years, and that helps to change the way that I look at science, right? But at the core of the kind of consulting I do is really evidence-based, is to draw on that science, but temper that with real-world experience. A lot of the stuff that happens in laboratories has important implications for the real world, but because it's taken place in a very artificial setting, there can often be hurdles to translating that. And I think, to use athletics as an example, a coach or an athlete knows what those hurdles are, right? And so I like to think that my having led this dual life might have some value in helping others move forward in their endeavors by drawing both on my own personal experiences as an athlete and my scientific background, and kind of marrying those two together. Because there is an art and a science to personal growth, whether it's in the athletic field or outside in the world of business and so forth.
And Scott, if people would like to learn more about you or get in touch with you if they're interested in working with you, where should they go?
Yeah, well, I have a website. It's Neurocognitive Consulting, or neurocognitive consultants.com. But they can also just reach out to me. My email is very simple. It's Frey, Frey, neuro at gmail.com. And I'm happy to respond to people's thoughts and questions. And I'd enjoy that.
Awesome. Scott, thanks so much for being here today and for sharing your story and your knowledge that you've worked hard to gain throughout your career. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. It's really nice to meet you. I enjoy your podcast a lot.
Thanks for listening. I really appreciate it, Scott. Have a great day.
You too. Bye.